This is Sky News at 10, our top story. Dominic Raab resigns from government after a report into bullying, but the Deputy Prime Minister says the decision is flawed. The departure kicked off a reshuffle. Oliver Dowden appointed new Deputy PM and Alex Chalk the new Justice Secretary. Now the Prime Minister faces questions over his handling of the case.
He should never have appointed him in the first place, along with other members of the Cabinet that shouldn't have been appointed. And then he didn't sack him. And even today, it's Raab who resigns rather than the Prime Minister who acts.
Also tonight, a number of major companies quit or suspend their membership of the CBI after rape allegations spark a mass exodus. The Health Secretary says he plans to pursue legal action against a nurses' union over strike action this month. Ukraine's missing children. We have a special report on Russian soldiers taking children from their families and into occupied territory.
This, the ICC says, was actually an organised conspiracy to abduct children.
Four days of climate protests begin in central London, with up to 30,000 people calling for urgent action. We speak to the rugby player breaking the stigma around mental health in sport.
Effectively, I couldn't do my job. And I felt as if I was letting my coaches down, letting my players down, letting my club down, and letting all my family and friends down.
And we'll take a first look at tomorrow's front pages in our press preview from 10:30. Good evening. The Prime Minister has appointed a new deputy today following Dominic Raab's resignation from government after a report upheld some allegations of intimidating behaviour and a misuse of power. The probe by Adam Tolley KC was investigating 8 formal complaints. Dominic Raab says he kept his word and stepped down, but said the decision is flawed and sets a dangerous precedent. Tonight, we'll take a detailed look at the findings of the report and the allegations that were made, as well as gauge what people think about Mr Raab's resignation. Our political editor, Beth Rigby, has tonight's first report.
Dominic Raab now out of government.
Are you confident you're going to clear your name?
Absolutely.
But that wasn't possible. The publication of this damning report sealing his fate and forcing the Deputy Prime Minister's resignation. 8 formal complaints about his conduct investigated by Adam Tolley KC, 2 of them upheld. The first from his time as Foreign Secretary, where his behaviour was found to be intimidating, unreasonably and persistently aggressive, and his conduct deemed an abuse or misuse of power. At the Ministry of Justice too, another complaint affirmed. Raab found to have acted in a manner which was intimidating, while his conduct was insulting. That language in keeping with the testimony I'd heard from some of those who'd seen Mr Raab's behaviour.
The way he would treat people, belittle people, interrogate people, ignore people. He created an awful atmosphere.
They were nervous about going into meetings with him because they feared having strips torn off them.
Despite the verdict, this a reluctant resignation. Dominic Raab writing to the Prime Minister to say, whilst I feel duty-bound to accept the outcome of the inquiry, it dismissed all but 2 of the claims levelled against me. He continued, in setting the threshold for bullying so low, this inquiry has set a dangerous precedent. It will encourage spurious complaints against ministers and have a chilling effect on those driving change on behalf of your government. Dominic Raab in his constituency today trying to drive home his defence.
Almost all of the complaints against me were dismissed. And what this doesn't give you, it's a handful of very senior officials. None of the junior complaints were upheld. And I got on and dealt with hundreds of civil servants, thousands of other people in prison service and the court service. And what you've got is the risk here of a very small minority of very activist civil servants with the passive-aggressive culture of the civil service.
The PM accepting the resignation, but clearly pained, responding, "It is with great sadness that I have accepted your resignation adding he'd always be grateful for Mr Raab's steadfast personal support and the dedication, commitment and loyalty he gave to the role of Deputy PM. For the opposition, the person to blame for all of this mess, the PM himself.
What I think this shows is the continual weakness of the Prime Minister, because there's a double weakness here. He should never have appointed him in the first place, along with other members of the Cabinet that shouldn't have been appointed. And then he didn't sack him. And even today, it's Raab who resigns rather than the Prime Minister who acts.
Early afternoon, new appointments came. Oliver Dowden, a long-time Sunak loyalist, appointed the new Deputy PM, and Alex Chalk is Justice Secretary. But fresh faces do little to change an uncomfortable reality. In the end, Mr Raab's departure was inevitable. After 2 bullying complaints were upheld, he had no option but to quit. But this is about much more than just Mr Raab's career. It affects the Prime Minister too. 3 of his cabinet ministers have been forced to leave government in the past 5 months. And you have to ask yourself, is it really a government of integrity, professionalism and accountability? Well, the Prime Minister's backers will say that this shows he's prepared to clean up his top table. Others will argue that it shows a serious lack of judgment that he put Raab and others into his cabinet in the first place. Either way, what Raab's departure brings back to this place is a sense of scandal, exactly what this new PM was desperate to avoid. Beth Rigby, Sky News, Westminster.
Well, Adam Tolley, KC, delivered his 47-page report into Dominic Raab's behaviour to the Prime Minister yesterday after a 5-month investigation into 8 accusations of bullying. Deputy Political Editor Sam Coates has been looking at the detail of the findings.
This is the report that ended Dominic Raab's career. It took 5 months to write, almost 50 pages. Adam Tolley, KC, upheld 2 complaints about the behaviour of Dominic Raab. One when he was Foreign Secretary, the other when he was Justice Secretary. Let's look at both. So here's from when he was Foreign Secretary, and Adam Tolley found that the former Deputy Prime Minister acted in a way which was intimidating in the sense of unreasonably and persistently aggressive. He found that his conduct also involved an abuse or a misuse of power in a way that undermines or humiliates. His conduct was bound to be experienced as undermining or humiliated by the affected individual, and it was so experienced. Now let's look at his time as Justice Secretary. And here, Adam Tolley describes how Dominic Raab would get frustrated when some of his steers, his recommendations about proposed reforms, hadn't been implemented in the papers that were being presented to him. And he describes that there was a bit of dispute over exactly what Dominic Raab said, whether he said the work was utterly useless or woeful. But then Tolley concludes, on balance, I think that these were the words used. They comprised criticism that was not in the nature of constructive feedback. They were reasonably understood as insulting personal criticism. But then there's some of the context around the behaviour at that time. This is also from Dominic Raab's time in the Ministry of Justice. And he talked to Dominic Raab, who made clear that he takes a strong view, the former minister, that officials should be prepared to answer questions about the things that they're presenting to him. And if they don't, he's quite prepared to offer criticism. In the words of Tolley, unconstructive criticism. What Dominic Raab would do is he'd talk about the lack of basic information, or the basics that they were able to provide. Now, Tolley's view is that this is unacceptable. He says it's likely to be experienced as an unfairly personal criticism by the individual to whom the comment is directed and was so experienced by some individuals. Viewers will have to decide whether or not it's right for a minister to get cross because civil servants apparently not doing their job. But then there is this. Dominic Raab makes another allegation that the policy priorities including the Bill of Rights and reforms to the parole system were not liked by the civil service. Dominic Raab perceived what he described as cultural resistance to these policy items, amongst others, in his remit. So he's alleging that civil servants, in some cases, were biased and not doing what he wants. But the most toxic allegation was also from his time as Justice Secretary. And that's because there was a big group complaint that was made to Adam Tolley, a group of junior civil servants all working together. Now, Adam Tolley admits he doesn't know how many people were involved. But look at this. only some of those individuals in this group had any direct experience of the Deputy Prime Minister. Some had never even met him at all, but were seeking to support their colleagues. I think some Tories, when looking at that sentence, might be wondering whether some people in Whitehall had an agenda.
Well, allegations of bullying have dogged Dominic Raab for years, with civil servants from more than one department raising concerns about his behaviour. The investigation has shone a light on bullying culture in the workplace and the system around reporting issues in government departments. Our political correspondent Ali Fortescue reports.
The corridors of power are a unique workplace. The long hours, the demanding ministers. Is it too hard to ask for help?
How difficult is it right now for a civil servant to raise a complaint about a cabinet minister?
If you raise a complaint against even the most senior person, a permanent secretary in your department, there's a process there. If it comes to complaining about a minister, there's nothing. There's not even a procedure. There's nothing laid down. There's nothing written down. You have got to complain under the ministerial code, which means it goes to the Prime Minister. And the Prime Minister decides whether it's even investigated. The Prime Minister gets a veto, and this Prime Minister has decided to retain that veto.
Ministers don't line manage civil servants, but there is a power dynamic in a high-pressure environment.
I think that there is a generational issue.
Caroline worked in the Foreign Office and number 10 for 7 years.
The politicians who get to the top are probably facing, are having to live quite a robust life. You know, they are constantly being criticised. They're constantly under scrutiny. They will feel quite isolated sometimes, I think, in their departments. They will have a small political staff around them who will be responsible for ensuring that what they are trying to do is indeed being done. It does mean that there's a potential mismatch of expectations.
2 of the bullying complaints against Dominic Raab were upheld, but it wasn't totally clear-cut, and it's brought up a bigger debate beyond Westminster about the culture in the workplace and what is deemed appropriate.
We've had a shift and a move away from needing to prove that somebody intends to upset you or cause you serious distress, and more of a focus, not a complete focus, but more of a focus on how that conduct is received by the individual. I mean, we're probably nothing like as deferential to our bosses than perhaps we were a generation ago, and that's a societal shift. In some ways, it's probably a good thing, but in other ways, there is that clash.
But the verdict on Dominic Raab is in.
He was a bully. Of course he has to go.
It's black and white as things get.
And tonight, he's out of government. The PM says there were shortfalls in the process. It seems all sides agree on that. Ali Fortescue, Sky News, Westminster.
Our political correspondent Joe Pike is at Downing Street for us tonight. And Joe, the resignation of Dominic Raab isn't the only thing putting pressure on the Prime Minister tonight.
It certainly isn't, Gillian. I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that resignations do not normally happen like this. And we still do not know what happened in the mysterious 24 hours between the report being received at number 10 and by Mr Raab and Mr Raab announcing his resignation. It's very curious. Certainly, it may be due to the fact that Mr Tolley's report was a little bit more nuanced than some had been expecting. Is it possible that the Prime Minister was swithering and even considered trying to hold on to his deputy? I'm sure Rishi Sunak will be questioned about that in the coming days. Certainly that 24 hours gave Mr Raab the opportunity to craft his narrative, to ready his rebuttal, and that narrative has been dominant today. He's certainly got his point out there, and it has made a lot of headlines, far more headlines than the views of the civil servants he is said to have treated so badly, though I'm told tonight many of them feel relieved this process is over and relieved that Mr Raab has left government. Yes, Rishi Sunak will be hoping these headlines over his deputy now start to dissipate, but as you intimate there, Gillian, another story not going away, and that is industrial action, especially since tonight the Health Secretary, Steve Barclay, has announced that he is going to try and take the Royal College of Nurses to court over industrial action they are planning to take towards the end of this month. 48 hours of industrial action in England. He believes that is potentially unlawful and they are going beyond their strike mandate. It is, though, a high-stakes strategy because opinion polls suggest there is high public support for striking nurses. Therefore, Gillian, I'd argue the two bodies, the government and the RCN, are on a collision course. And as I say, that seems a high-stakes strategy for the government.
Indeed, Joe, thank you. And for more analysis from Joe on today's events in Westminster, if you scan the QR code on your screen right now, you can listen to a special edition of the Sky News Daily podcast. You can subscribe to the Daily for free wherever you get your podcasts from. The Confederation of British Industry, known as the CBI, is an organisation which acts as a voice for businesses. But tonight it's announced it is suspending all activity following a police investigation into 2 allegations of rape. In the last few hours, dozens of major firms have either cancelled or suspended their membership, including NatWest, Lloyds, John Lewis, Meta and Rolls-Royce. Our business correspondent Paul Kelso reports.
For almost 60 years, the CBI has claimed to speak for business, but that voice may soon fall silent after some of Britain's biggest companies rushed to end their association with the lobby group. The crisis began with reports of serious misconduct, including an allegation of rape against a senior manager at an office party on the Thames. Now, a second woman has alleged she was raped by 2 CBI employees working at an overseas office, triggering a flood of companies to suspend or end their membership, including NatWest, Virgin Media, BT, AstraZeneca, Ford and Meta, owners of Facebook.
The companies we're talking about today, they have deep values and they have leaders who follow through on their values within their own workplace. I think after a point, it becomes untenable for them to remain in a situation where there is a string of very, very serious allegations.
The CBI has already sacked its Director General, Tony Danker, for unrelated misconduct he says made him a scapegoat. Now the organisation has effectively frozen day-to-day business and signalled the CBI as we know it may be over. In a statement, the CBI board said, "We have taken the difficult but necessary decision to suspend all policy and membership activity until an extraordinary general meeting in June. At the EGM, we will put forward proposals for a refocused CBI to our membership for them to decide on the future role and purpose of the organisation." John Lewis is one of dozens of household name businesses that have walked away from the CBI, and the government has already said it won't talk to the lobby group while investigations are ongoing. Without the confidence of its members or the ear of ministers, the CBI can't make the case for business and plainly can't promote best practice. Its future is in serious doubt. The members who've called the CBI's fate into question will decide if it still has a voice in the summer. Paul Kelso, Sky News.
To Ukraine now, and last night we brought you a special report on 15 orphans taken at gunpoint to Russia. Tonight, Sky News can bring you the story of Sasha from Mariupol, who at 12 years old was taken from his mother by Russian soldiers. Our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, travelled to Kiev to speak to Sasha and his grandmother.
Sasha lives with his grandmother now in central Ukraine. This little boy was injured in the eye by shrapnel from a rocket when he and his mother left their Mariupol basement to cook food outside. The Ukrainian military looked after them until they surrendered to the Russians as Mariupol fell. Taken to a so-called filtration camp, Russian soldiers took him away from his mother and sent him to Russian-controlled territory in Donetsk. In a cafe, Sasha showed me pictures of his mum. He doesn't know what's happened to her, but the Russians said he'd never see her again.
А тоді маму опрошували, і після того сказали, що приїде Новозовська служба по ділах дітей та заберуть мене від мами. І вони говорили, що я мамі не потрібен, що вона не приїде за мною.
How was your mother at this stage? What was she saying?
Ну, тоді мене вже забрали від мами, навіть не дали попрощатися. І я вже почти рік не бачу маму і не чув її голос.
Sasha was saved by his grandmother after doctors posted his picture on social media. Outraged, she travelled through Russia to get him back. What was it like when you saw Sasha for the first time?
Я його обняла, кажу, дитино моя, ти тепер зі мною, кажу, ти тепер, кажу, мій. Ми будемо, кажу, і маму шукати. Десь, кажу, будемо і маму шукати. І він же ж, бабу, а ти їдеш до мене? Кажу, їду. Кажу, аж якось треба то. Бабу, так тут сюди вже стріляють. Ну, кажу, поки, щоб тебе нікуди не завезли, мені треба їхати і забирати тебе.
But the vast majority of children weren't taken by the military. In fact, They were allowed to go on trips described as basically summer camps and a respite from the fighting by their parents. This, the ICC says, was actually an organised conspiracy to abduct children. Nastia stayed in touch with her mum by sending videos from a camp in Crimea. The 15-year-old showed the room she shared with 2 other girls and how they celebrated Christmas. One video shows them on a trip to the seaside. On another, they're at a youth club disco. This anti-trafficking campaigners say is the Russian authorities trying to brainwash the children into thinking of a new Russian life. They were also being educated on the positives of Russian culture. When did you think, I'm not going home?
Ну, нас начали задерживать, допустим, 2 недели прошло, нам сказали, что вот такого-то, такого-то числа вы поедете обратно домой, не переживайте, все дела. Мы не поехали. Потом назначали, в общем, даты, мы не ехали, а потом нам сказали, что это эвакуация, и все, типа, неопределенное время мы остаемся. Вот. И только родители могут забрать.
Just like Sasha's grandmother, Nastia's mum travelled through Russia, jumping through bureaucratic hoops to get her daughter back. This was their joyful reunion. Other mothers joined her, reunited with their children and taken home. The process of finding the missing children goes on. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Ukraine.
It's being called the big one. 4 days of climate protests by Extinction Rebellion, Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and more than 200 organisations calling for urgent action from the government. It was a protest with a different field, some of the recent disruption at the Snooker and the Grand National in the last week, and aims to attract tens of thousands of people over the weekend. Our home editor, Jason Farrell, reports from central London.
They can bang the drum, but who will listen? Today there were different messages outside each government department. Against coal development, water pollution, oil exploration.
We're here outside the Department for Net Zero and Energy Security because although this department keep changing their name, they're not changing what they actually do inside. And what we want to ask them to do is the same thing that environmentalists have been asking them to do since the year I was born, which is to stop the expansion of the oil and gas we know threatens human survival.
The climate activists' message is familiar, but this is a new tactic. More speeches, less superglue. Discourse, not disruption. This is about encouraging all comers to the cause.
I'm surprised at the people who are coming down in a way, because when we started XR, I expected a lot of my friends and family to show up. And this time, the invitations landed, and loads of those people who I was surprised weren't coming are all showing up. And we've got over 200 organisations backing it, so it's good.
The main organisers, Extinction Rebellion, says this weekend we shouldn't expect the stop oil-style tactics of shocking stunts, like the one this week at the World Snooker Championships, considered a turn-off to many. For example, XR promised not to disrupt the London Marathon. Writers such as Zadie Smith spoke.
All these scientists repeating inconvenient facts.
And Brian Eno, record producer for U2 and Coldplay, also joined the cause.
We think that there's a crisis, and our government apparently doesn't think there's a crisis. It's just not taking the matter seriously at all. I keep saying to everybody, we're all on the same side in this. It's just that some people haven't yet realised. And the government, unfortunately, are at the head of those people who haven't yet realised.
Even without arrests, there's still drama in the way they deliver their message. But many of their demands come with consequences and tough decisions for any government grappling with high energy prices, inflation and a cost of living crisis. But they say, in the face of a climate crisis, the silence is deafening. Jason Farrell, Sky News.
Fighting has continued in Sudan today, despite an agreement to hold a 72-hour ceasefire. The Sudanese army and a paramilitary group, RSF, have been fighting for power since last Saturday. And tonight, Sky News understands that Britain is putting troops and aircraft on standby at an overseas airbase to be ready to airlift embassy staff and UK citizens from the country. Our Africa correspondent Yusra El-Bagir has been speaking to foreign nationals trapped in the capital, Khartoum.
Blasts drown out the call to prayer. A day to celebrate the end of Ramadan is marked by endless violence. Many remain trapped as safe routes open, then close, including a British teacher from Coventry.
There were 3 big booms. One was massive. We just sort of lay here, me and my wife. We didn't actually talk to each other, and we shook.
What do you and fellow Brits feel about how the British Embassy has approached this?
I'll do it in 2 words. It's gone from anger, definitely there's lots of anger in there, to comical. I think between those 2 is where most of us are, at least the Brits that I've talked to. We're not very impressed, I think I'd put it that way.
People continue to flee and volunteers are working overtime to coordinate their safe passage.
While Sudanese army and RSF are attacking each other, my friend and I are trying to find best passage for people to leave their location to another safer place.
He makes one of many calls to a friend, asking if her road is safe to use. Mozab has helped many to safety, including American researcher Rebecca. Her calls to her embassy were fruitless.
I am livid at my embassy. I think that their advice actively is going to hurt people. All of us, Sudanese and foreigners, deserve safety and are at risk because of this war. And while foreigners have been failed by their embassies, we have all been failed by the Sudanese generals and foreign powers that placed us in this situation.
A week of terror that has felt like a lifetime for the millions who see no end in sight. Yusra El-Bagir, Sky News.
Mental health is a subject seldom talked about in sporting circles, but one rising star of Welsh rugby has said he wants to break the stigma around it and announced he is stepping back from the sport to treat his own mental health. Ospreys scrum half Harry Morgan revealed he tried to take his own life earlier this year. A warning, this report from our sports correspondent Rob Harris discusses suicide and other issues some viewers might find distressing.
This is how all rugby players dream of starting their careers.
Harry Morgan goes for the try line! That could well be a game breaker.
Harry Morgan was living the dream at the Ospreys from his teens, but with a hidden, growing anguish few athletes talk about.
I always found rugby as my escape. Mental escape. I was always able to take my frustrations from day-to-day life and frustrations of losing my grandparents at a young age who were a massive influence on me. Those frustrations I always took out on the rugby field, but losing that ability to be able to play through injury then took away my escape.
What are those thoughts that are sort of going through your mind at this point?
Effectively, I couldn't do my job. And I felt as if I was letting my coaches down, letting my players down, letting my club down, and letting all my family and friends down.
Stress and suffering built up inside the scrum half, who was already scoring points for Wales in the Six Nations for the under-20s. The focus was on physical, not mental recovery.
Thoughts come of, what's my point in life? What is my purpose? I had no purpose. Whereas rugby has always been my purpose. I'd lost the ability to play rugby, so I'd lost a purpose. That's when the suicidal sort of thoughts and planning stuff sort of came into action after Christmas time. Then February, it obviously came to a head where I tried taking my own life. And I don't want to be in this position again. I'm to sit in hospital with my parents, talking to doctors about why I've done it and stuff, and seeing my parents upset. I don't want to be that person anymore.
It led to Morgan at 23 taking the difficult decision this week to step back from playing the sport he loves. Speaking publicly for the first time about his darkest moments, to show speaking helps, to show there's no shame, to show it does get better.
I think it's just take every day as it comes. try and be positive about everything. If something negative happens, let's try and look for a positive within that negative and flip it on its head so we're not constantly thinking negative.
Returning to playing rugby in the future is a possibility. But for now, mental well-being is the priority. And Harry Morgan's mission is ensuring no other rugby player, no other person suffers in silence. Rob Harris, Sky News, Llandarcy in South Wales.